just means I can't see my notes. Okay, gang. Hello, everyone. So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you. So, today I'm going to be talking about nature and disability. As a forewarning, I do not have a doctorate. I'm not a professor of any kind. I'm simply a person who is very passionate about anthropology, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute. So if I go off on a tangent as well about something that seems completely unrelated, just humor me, bear with me. Okay, hi gang. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jess. I'm the DASC social media chair. I'm an anthropology and art history double major and a museum studies and forensic science minor. So most of my area of interest in terms of anthropology is early man and indigenous peoples. I really love the idea of studying the first people who kind of came into contact with the land that we live in, and I love osteology and archaeology. Osteology, for those of you who don't know, is the study of bones and skeletal remains. Anyone who knows me knows I love dinosaurs and bones and everything, so osteology is a fave. And I call myself a monkey major, so I have my monkey and I have my monkey shot because there are many different fields of anthropology. There's biological anthropology, which is about primates, which is why I call myself a monkey major. And that also includes human biology and morphology and evolution. And there's also linguistic anthropology, so the study of languages, cultural anthropology, the study of culture, and archaeological/historical anthropology, which is, I think, what a lot of people tend to focus on when you just mention anthropology, but it's an incredibly broad field. And one of the more recent emerging fields within the discipline has been environmental anthropology. So the idea of cultural ecology emerged in the 1970s, and it was mainly focused on the question of how human society influences nature. How do we adapt? How do we evolve together through a long period of time? I mean, we've been on the planet for thousands and thousands of years, and the environment has had a huge impact on our behavior and how we influence one another. So there was this kind of bubble umbrella term of cultural ecology that was very focused on this. And one of the biggest reasons that people were starting to ask these kinds of questions was because of the Cold War. And there was this large anti-colonial sentiment where what was going on was a lot of countries and nations, specifically in what we consider developing countries or third world nations, like in Africa and places, they were becoming independent. And a lot of Western society was kind of like, where are these new people going to fit into our global market and our global economy? And how, I mean, this is like the classic white people trying to like make, you know, these historically oppressed countries fit into the mold that they themselves have created. So there are obviously some big issues with this idea of cultural ecology. It portrays the ecosystem as being very closed, very one-dimensional, that it kind of neglects the idea that humans depend on nature as much as nature depends on us. And also this idea highlights a whole mess of problematic colonial thinking. Like I was just saying, it's all about how these newly independent countries can fit into a system that has been written out by westernized society. And again, another big part of that global market and global economy is capitalism. And a lot of these countries historically did very well before colonialism and before capitalism, using their own system, economic system. But now they've been thrown all over the place by all these white people who think they know what the best thing to do is. And it also neglects, going back to humans depending on nature, it also neglects how social power dynamics, the asymmetry in relationships, can also be manifested in our resources. My monkey is falling out of my pocket. Yeah. So there's this really great quote, and from that is how environmental anthropology emerges. It tries to take those very basic concepts that cultural ecologists were kind of starting to hint at, and expands on that in a less Eurocentric kind of perspective. It broadens that umbrella term. So moving along to this concept of nature and the environment, and how cultural anthropologists were now faced with this task of breaking down cultural ecology into something that made more sense. And a good way to start with any kind of discipline is starting to try and figure out definitions for words and concepts that can be used by the discipline as a whole. So this is a quote that I really like, from Raymond Williams from 1976, so when this field was just kind of emerging, and he says, nature is perhaps the most complex word in the English language. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, getting on to my project and nature and the environment and everything. So, transitions. So the concept of nature. So I'm just gonna throw these questions out here. It's like the worst thing ever when professors like ask questions and there's just like awkward silence. So if no one wants to jump in, that's absolutely fine. But I was just throwing out a few questions. How would you define nature? How would you define this concept of wilderness? Do you view these words differently or similarly? Is there a different connotation for both? I will sip my water, and if anyone has anything to say, jump in. If not, I will put my water down and continue.
I'll go. I think when I view the word wilderness, like it is in the absence of like human presence or like human interaction with. Whereas like nature, like I like feel like we have to assume like contact among humans as well as many other, everything else that is going on. But I think like wilderness has the feel that, it's not like often doesn't have, it isn't often supposed to have human contact. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's just my feeling on it.
No, I think that's definitely a great idea. Anyone else while I sip my water?
For me, I feel like, oh, sorry, was someone else
No,
talking?
go ahead.
For me, I feel like all wilderness can be nature, but not all nature can be wilderness. I don't know why.
Bars.
Like, I feel like what? Like, I feel like wilderness is, for me, feels woodsy, and this is not scientific or educational in any means, but wilderness feels woodsy to me. But nature can be woodsy, but nature can also not be woodsy.
Wilderness feels like if you let nature be unrestrained.
I'm having Zoom problems. Give me a second. Sorry, my Zoom just completely went weird again. Give me 1 second. Can someone say something really quickly?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, so all those points, some of which I think Caroline was saying something and I didn't hear your point, and I apologize. My Zoom was freaking out. But yeah, there's that idea and that concept that nature and wilderness is something that's absent from humans and absent from our contact and everything like that. Transition. So yeah, there's this idea of wilderness as being something that is detached from us, that this is, these are some ideas brought up by another environmental anthropologist, William Cronin, in his article, really famous article, The Trouble with Wilderness, was this idea, he had this idea that the concept of nature and the concept of wilderness, we use them very interchangeably in our vocabulary, but they have very different connotations. There's this idea of wilderness, like Cole was saying, being absent, being very woodsy, I think Niley said, and that there's also this idea of it being kind of scary in that way. It's this sublime, this idea of the sublime and being awe-inspiring and in a lot of ways almost scary. I think it's really interesting when I was first learning about this stuff that when you think about like fairy tales and folklore and everything, it's always people go into the woods and they have an encounter of some kind and maybe something goes wrong. Maybe they find a gingerbread house and they get shoved in the oven by a witch. Like there's all these weird like connotations that we tend to place on this concept of wilderness being very detached from us and being this sacred place, and with that definition and with those ideas, it becomes a place that we feel like we have to protect and we have to preserve, because this is almost like to a lot of people a religious experience. I mean, you go to a national park, you go to the Grand Canyon, and people are awe-inspired and they feel almost like a divine presence in a way in these kinds of beautiful, large, expansive landscapes. But there are some big issues with this, as you can imagine. I think this picture, I feel like everyone who's ever taken a US history class has seen about 1 million times. But yeah, so this idea of wilderness and nature being this kind of escapism was something that was promoted heavily in the 19th century with the emerging middle class. People wanted a break from industrialism and their working lives, and they couldn't afford to go to places like Europe or just Europe or wherever they wanted to go, but they could go somewhere beautiful within the United States. They could go to, somewhere beautiful. And this kind of, as well, this idea of the American frontier, right? So thinking of Manifest Destiny, the little lady flying across killing Native Americans and all that problematic stuff was a projection of this idea of kind of capturing that beautiful wilderness and also seeing it as a place for them to prove themselves. So, I mean, you have the Wild West, right? This connotation of lawlessness and, like I said, killing Native Americans and establishing American land, like claiming land and saying this isn't yours anymore, this is ours. So it kind of became this place where people, specifically white men, could go into these frontiers, this American frontier, and prove themselves. And I mean, America is a very good example of this because, like I said, like when you say the word frontier, it's pretty synonymous with American history and the Wild West and everything, but you can see this all across the globe of nature being seen as a frontier. But unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever probably you want to say, but there's only so much land in America, right? You can't, it's not infinite. It's not like the whole universe. So with the American frontier starting to disappear towards the end of the 1800s, you have this kind of change in ideology where people have gone out, they've claimed everything, they've said this is ours now. But then they're lacking a place where white men, where are the white men going to go and prove themselves? These poor white men, where are they going to go and claim their national identity? What are they going to do? So now it became preserving, again, the idea of wilderness and preservation, of saying, to preserve our pride in this white masculinity that we've found and we've claimed, let's preserve it and let's do everything we can to protect this land. And I think it's taking an environmental anthropology class was really, and this is me absolutely going off on a tangent, but it's really interesting learning about how this idea of preservation can actually be very harmful. I think it's everywhere you go online, it's like, let's plant all these trees and let's, planting trees is the big one. But a lot of the times where people are planting these trees is Western companies going to places in Asia and actually taking land from these indigenous peoples to then plant these trees. So it's just very backwards. And obviously I'm not saying that we shouldn't plant trees, and obviously I'm not saying that all preservation is bad, but there's definitely a balance between making that space for preservation, but also prioritizing the needs of individuals, which is kind of, again, I'll get to my project, but that was kind of the idea that I was building off of, is this kind of balancing act between the two. So yeah, the issue with frontiers, I mean, I don't have to probably say this, it was framed completely as a space only for white, straight, male, able-bodied, and atypical individuals. I mean, again, it's interesting to think about, because we have these connotations of nature and wilderness as being this place of freedom and absent of human society and structures. But when you analyze it and you break it down, it's entrenched with that. You can't separate that. Because this is a place that was only made accessible to a certain group of people. And also this idea of associating those wild spaces with national pride, it justifies violence, historical colonial violence against continents and, developing nations in the name of preserving wilderness. I mean, again, the Native Americans are a key example of that, of kicking them out of national parks in America and saying, I'm sorry, but you can't live here anymore. You can't live on your ancestral land anymore. And again, that was done in the name of preservation, right? Of preserving this wilderness. Just gonna get me heated. So yeah, again, it's this idea of preserving, getting all the people out, just builds back into that narrative that nature can only exist in spaces where it's untouched, that we have to get rid of all of the humans in order for nature to be at its peak, at its best, at its most sublime, most beautiful. For us to feel closer to God, we have to be there in those spaces. So get rid of all the people. So what the heck, Jess? Why are you talking about all this, and what is the accessibility? This is DASC. Absolutely. So yeah, this gets me onto my research project. So again, as I was saying previously, I was considering the balancing act between preservation, keeping all the humans out, but then also nature in of itself is inaccessible, right? It's when you think about it in its most basic terms, it's overgrown and it's full of trees and mountains and uneven landscapes, and that's, for a lot of people who identify as disabled, is incredibly inaccessible. So how do you balance accessibility with also this Western idea of preserving everything and like and keeping everything from being touched by human interference? Like where's the balance? What the heck are we doing, you know? So when I came to my professor with this idea, he's been teaching this class. I think he told me he'd been teaching this class for a few years now, and no one had ever actually posed this idea to him. No one had ever really thought to ask the question, hey, we're talking a lot about preservation and human relationships with nature, and how environmental anthropology is this great thing because, unlike cultural ecology, it focuses more on the human element of nature, how those intertwine, and also the historic inequality of keeping certain individuals away from those natural landscapes. But why are we not talking about this? And what I found was, not only had we not discussed it in class, but there's very little to no information on disability in the park systems. However, when you go to any of their websites, or you email them and ask them about their policies, all of them have this like statement of commitment, like, we will be as accessible as we can be, and we are here for the whole community. And they use all these, words and statements that are just empty, because very little is actually being done. And even on exploring activism groups specifically within Austin, I was doing all this research, just to clarify, specifically in the city of Austin. When looking for activist groups, they weren't discussing it either. And there are activist groups, with gender equality in nature and race equality within nature, but no one was really talking about the disabled community. They weren't anywhere in the discussion. So what the heck? Ableism in our parks, absolutely. So it seems to me, from what I've read, the literature that I've read, and the research that I did, is very little people seem to be talking about it because of this kind of cultural narrative that parks are only for physical activities, like trails, or going for a jog, or going for like a long walk and stuff like that. It kind of implies this idea that if you're disabled, you don't really want to go outside, that you just kind of want to stay in your house and be sad all the time. And I think that's horrible. These parks and these spaces are supposed to be a place of freedom and experiencing these beautiful places, these sublime places. But for some reason, it's like, oh yeah, the disabled community, they don't really want that anyway. Like, what are they gonna do with that resource? And again, that's just contributing to this hugely ableist narrative that's a systematic problem across the US. In my research, there was nowhere really, no like public parks that I could find, outdoor, just regular public parks, that really were doing anything major in trying to make it more accessible to the disabled community. However, in Canada, because Canada is just always miles ahead of everyone, they're doing some amazing work. I can't remember off the top of my head which university it is, but there's a university in Canada that is working with the park system, in which they are implementing tons of different principles of universal design, making wheelchair accessible, interpretive trails, and really being able to give that first-hand actual interactive experience with these local national landscapes. It seems such a shame to have a monopoly on the outdoors and being able to say these people aren't allowed here because they can't be here. They can't be here safely. So what about Austin? So yeah, again, my project was just I feel like I haven't properly stated it, but my specific project was excuse me, looking at public parks within the city of Austin and seeing what they were doing to make them all more accessible. So what we did was we were able to talk to a Maria Dodd, the programs manager for Shoal Creek Conservancy, which is a local public park within Austin, and ask her about some like what the heck's going on with this. And it was a very interesting, I did this project in a group, and I personally didn't get to talk to her, but I did hear the audio recording of the interview, and it was a lot of evasion, I'll put it that way. So we asked her the kind of planning process that really goes into building a park, and how / where, I guess, accessibility kind of comes into that conversation. So what we were told was that basically what they do is, the first thing, they just lay a trail. They clear out green spaces and they lay a trail, and they don't, no real questions of accessibility comes in at this point. It's just a trail for able-bodied people, and questions of accessibility come much later in the process, like years later, when they feel like they're established enough, I guess, to be able to make those changes. But she said very explicitly, priority is always given to green spaces. So if it came to widening a path into those green spaces would always be prioritized. So in a lot of these parks, again, priority is just not being given to accessibility. And what she did say, though, however, there was a positive in this conversation, that Proposition B, Prop B, was passed in the city of Austin in 2020. And it means that the parks in Austin, the public parks, are going to get a lot more funding. And one of the things that she expressed in the conversation was that this is a great opportunity for being able to implement some accessible changes. But, you know, again, it's really the bare minimum at this point. And yeah, not great. So again, the conclusions of my project was that in Austin, they're really doing the bare minimum. They're meeting again, with ADA guidelines, it's a pretty gray area when it comes to public parks. It seems pretty unenforced, again, just because of this narrative of the disabled community not really caring. And so, yeah, they're doing the bare minimum. And also, it seems like there was this idea in the conversations with people who worked at these parks departments, was they treated inaccessibility as this unavoidable, inevitable outcome. So no matter what they did, they saw it as a losing battle. Like no matter how much they could make things more accessible, they just had it doesn't matter what you do, some parts of it are going to be inaccessible, so why even try, seemed to be kind of the mentality. But as I've written in this PowerPoint, that just seems like a bit of an excuse from able-bodied individuals, because obviously, again, this doesn't affect them. They don't even think about it, right? But that's not good enough. So what's next? Does anyone have any ideas? Throw this out here while I take a long sip of water, a long old sip. Does anyone have any ideas of how we can make Austin's parks more accessible? I think that one of the cool things that I found while researching different like ways that parks can become more accessible was there was this very interactive element to it, and like the university in Canada, they had a lot of special programs and things so that it was more hands-on and interactive. And yeah, I feel like, again, it's just this whole thing of prioritizing green spaces over people seems very backwards. And I think that the only way that we can really, the city or anything can overcome that is by actually listening to the people and not these inanimate green spaces. I think, as always, it's so important. It's so important to have representation and having disabled individuals involved in the planning process. You know, how it seems like this is something that able-bodied people aren't thinking about. So it's important to have people asking these questions. And I mean, Austin is like one of the fastest growing cities in America right now. And with new housing projects popping up, there are going to be tons more public parks being opened and are in the planning process. And I think that it's so important to have people who are actually being affected by this, being able to share I mean, I just think that's terrible that they really said I love green spaces, but well, whatever. Again, like I wanted to give some history and background to this because I felt like it was important to be able to kind of show the reasoning behind these spaces being prioritized over people. Again, this idea of at all costs, we will protect the wilderness. We won't flatten it for ramps. We won't do anything like that because it's this precious, beautiful, sublime place where we can be close, have this like religious experience and everything. And I think that it's important to see it from a historical perspective as well, in terms of why these priorities are even in place, because they are very, very much so embedded in the infrastructure, and this is just another manifestation of it, I guess. So yeah, that was my project. Again, the results and the conclusion were disappointing, obviously, but I wasn't surprised, which again, in of itself is disappointing. But you know, so yeah. Does anyone have any questions for me about anything about my project or about anthropology or archaeology? Because I'm all monkeys.
So did y'all press the parks people about why it was okay to clear enough green space for like a trail for able-bodied people, but not enough for like a more accessible trail? Because like they still have to clear through green space to make the trails in the first place. Did you get anything on that?
Well, I think it goes back to the we just trying to think.
It seems like logically, like if you really want to like preserve the space so much, like you would force people to like go. Like, are you making the wilderness too unwild by like putting a trail there in the first place?
I mean, yeah, that was my question with this whole project, right? Was where does the payoff, like when does the Parks Department say, hey, we've cleared enough away? Because obviously, like they want to this idea of the wilderness and the sublime was very much so domesticated in the creation of these public parks and these public spaces, and that it could give, you know, these city goers a little pocket of it that they could just go to on their days off, on the weekend, so they didn't have to drive all the way to the nearest state park or whatever. But there's definitely this untold, unmarked line that the department is not willing to cross. And so trails that are smaller for able-bodied individuals, or hiking trails which often aren't paved, or like, yeah, paved over, they're willing to do that for people to be able to explore their own domesticated pocket of wilderness, but they aren't. But apparently making things wider and more accessible, or adding more rest stops, or making interactive signs and things like that, that's when it jumps over the line. So I think it's very it just ties back to the whole structural issue of ableism, in that what drew that line in the first place, if that makes sense.
I have a question. So I was thinking like how that lady said to prioritize more green spaces, and I don't want to be mean, but what if people are not that creative, you know? Because when people think of trails and ramps, they think of cement, and cement is like the opposite of like what people consider as nature. So what are some technology, or I don't know what branch is it, like architectural planning, what are I don't know that branch, is there any like new ways to incorporate, I guess would be something that's more nature based rather than cement, but also can be accessible to create those trails?
Absolutely. I think that those technologies, I mean, absolutely exist. I think a lot of this is able-bodied people overcomplicating the issue of accessibility, and thinking like they need to do all these grandiose, huge things, flatten everything out and level everything out, when in actual fact, if you just listen to the community and made some slight changes and implemented them in a way, like you said, that was more environmentally friendly, that would balance out, and that would be enough. But again, it's this whole mindset of when these people start thinking about that, it's always, oh well, what does it matter? Inaccessibility is always an inevitable outcome. There's very and also with the lack of activism in this area, specifically with disability and outdoor spaces and parks, there's not a lot of people asking those questions either, and saying, hey, look, is there something we can do? So I think that it is important that, you know, organizations like DASC talk about issues like this, and bring more awareness to them, just because a lot of people, it seems to me like an issue that people don't really think about, which is really unfortunate, of course. But yeah, again, I think I absolutely agree with you. I just think that they're very much so overcomplicating it to the extent where they just kind of give up and think, oh, it's inevitable, so why even bother? Which again just ties back to this ableist narrative of, well, you know, it must not, it's not even a space that disabled people want to be in, which is completely untrue, right? So yeah, absolutely. Great question.
I really want to thank you. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Cole.
Oh, no, I just want to say thank you so much for giving the presentation.
Yeah, Jess, I wanted to say the same thing. Again, it's not like a question, but I think that you brought up like a lot of good points that a lot of people don't think about. And I will say, as a wheelchair user who's lived in Austin all my life, the parks are not accessible like at all. And that has probably been something that I have like disliked my entire life. But I also, you know, I do think I've been really lucky to like go to like a lot of national parks. And they, you know, I've been really like, I've been impressed with how they've made things better in the past couple of years. I mean, they're a far way off from being anything like, you know, like Canada, for instance, or anything like that. But I went to the Grand Canyon, you know, for spring break, and I was like, I was pretty, you know, happy with the accessibility there. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but they had made like a new trail that kind of went around the rim of the canyon, that, you know, was made out of like I'm pretty sure it was cement or something similar, but like it was integrated enough into the landscape that it didn't really like, you know, stand out too much or, you know, detract obviously from the area around it. And it was also interactive in that it had a bunch of like rocks that are in the Grand Canyon, I guess, in the layers, and it had like, you know, that you could touch them or whatever and kind of, you know, see what they feel like and everything. And it was also very easy to get to like, because I was staying in like a hotel motel sort of thing that was near the rim, and it was very accessible to get to that trail, to the hotel, and then the hotel itself was really actually pretty accessible. So I've definitely had my fair share of horror stories in, you know, places like that, and I can definitely agree that in most instances it is an absolute afterthought. But I definitely think that like that trip to the Grand Canyon I had showed me it, like it doesn't have to be that way. It can be more integrated. It can be possible for, you know, disabled people to enjoy nature.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I mean, I think that's what makes it so annoying right in Austin is that it's a very seemingly, it doesn't take that much when like, especially because the way that they build parks, is they just put down these trails, they just whack them down, and it's like, okay, cool, but maybe before we even do that, we can think about doing it using a different material or making them wider or implementing different textures to make it more easy and accessible. Then instead of, so then making it accessible years later isn't so much of this big task where like the park has to shut down, you have to rip up all these existing trails, that it's something that it isn't an afterthought anymore. It would solve that for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks again for doing research into something I definitely feel like is overlooked.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I found it incredibly interesting, and it's just one of those things, and this is why I love my major, right? It's just really interesting to think about the stuff in a different perspective. And like I was talking about preservation and wilderness and wild spaces, and when you actually analyze them within a societal context, you get a very different perspective on what's actually going on in these places. So.
Right, totally. Yeah, I feel that sentence though where you were like, it's depressing, because I feel like a lot of visibility, accessibility stuff, it can be, but hopefully you can look forward to better, more accessible things in the future.
Absolutely.
People push for that. So
absolutely. Well, I'll stop sharing my screen. And thank you all for listening.